This week on Nuevo Gumbo.
What on earth does jazz have to do with Jesus?
So my name is Greg Edwards, and I am the senior pastor of Resurrected Life Community Church, United Church of Christ, and also the president and chief executive officer of the Resurrected Community Development Corporation. And amongst many other things, I've been a professional musician since the age of 16. And I'm here with my very good friend, someone who is a mentor, uh, Bill Howard, the Reverend Dr. Bill Howard, who is the pastor emeritus of the Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, among many other things. He and I both share a common love for jazz. So in this format, we're going to be talking a little bit about jazz, and we're going to be talking about the church, and we're going to be talking about the intersection of things that are usually seen as a dichotomy. You know, the church, specifically the Western church, has a way of separating things. And when I met Dr. Howard, true story, he and I both were staying at the same hotel, and we're both connected to Morehouse College. I was at Morehouse College in the College of Pastoral Leadership, and Dr. Howard was one of our mentors for that week-long residency period, he being an alum of Morehouse College. And I seen this very dapper young man who was waiting for the Morehouse bus, and he had these ostrich cowboy boots on and jeans. He had a blue blazer on and a white shirt and a bow tie, and he had a French beret on. And but I heard him as a musician. He had his earphones on, and I heard him listening, and I listened a little closer and realized he was listening to John Coltrane. And we didn't know each other. We both hopped on the same bus, and we've been very good friends and colleagues. And he's been my mentor on this latter part of my ministerial journey. And he can introduce himself, but I'm glad to be in the same room, if you will, with the Reverend Dr. Bill Howard.
Well, Dr. Edwards, let me say the operative words you used in that introduction was dapper young man. And I appreciate that very much. Um, and yeah, it's been great getting acquainted with you because it's not ordinary that a Baptist preacher meets another pastor who has the same passion for the music that we call jazz,
Yeah.
and also understands what a foolhardy thing it is to try and separate the spiritual depth of this jazz music from the yearnings of the human soul that we find in the church.
Mm.
This has always been fascinating for me. In fact, back in the old days in Princeton, Princeton, of course, was settled by Presbyterians, and you have John Witherspoon, who was the only pastor to sign the Declaration of Independence, Presbyterian minister. And there were two predominantly white Presbyterian churches within a block of each other, and they made the forward decision to merge. And they both had very substantial buildings. And so one of these buildings was left vacated. And
Hmm.
I actually contemplated in my 20s trying to found a church based exclusively on jazz as the music of worship. So this
Now you never
idea,
told me that.
pardon me?
That's new. You never told me that.
Yeah,
That's for the first time.
and people very close to me call the people with the white coats to come and get me. But actually, if the fundraising task had not been so you know overwhelming, and of course this building that had been vacated had high ceilings, so operating this building, it was a building of a certain age that had to be maintained. It would have been a very costly venture. And the idea at that time which, by the way, I don't think is quite as foreign today as it would have been in those days. But the idea in those days was so novel that people with resources who might be inclined to support me could never quite put jazz and the church together. So, as you know,
Mm.
later on in life, when I went to the parish, I somehow finagled the Jazz Vespers, which goes on to this day.
So that begs the question. So you're introducing something that I've never heard before. How did you first? What was your entree into jazz? Like what? How I mean, most preachers, Baptist preachers, or anyhow, are trying to get the best gospel choir, the best music,
Right,
and
right.
here we're talking about jazz, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
I'm just
Well,
curious.
I love gospel music. I love hymns. I love the anthems of the church. Uh, I grew up in South Georgia, as I think you certainly know. I talk about it all the time.
Americus, yeah,
And it was a rhythm and blues place. I mean, it was Jimmy Reed, Sonny Boy Williamson, Muddy Waters. I mean, these were the people that black people in my community loved, except the men who had returned to my community from the Second World War had been able to meet African American men from many other places, and not just African American men, but especially African American men from places like New York and Philadelphia and so forth. And they brought this music back to my little town. And
mhm,
on Saturdays in this working class community, one of the rituals was to brush the front yard, and we can come back to what that meant, brush
yeah,
the front yard,
yeah,
but also to wash the car if you had a car,
hmm,
and they would put their little record players. This is actually before high fidelity music. They would
sure,
put the 78s in the window, and and they would play this music, and I would be with their children playing in the front yard or whatever, and I would hear this music, and I would tell my friends, "Be quiet, be quiet. And
hmm.
they would say, "Oh, that's just Dad's music. You don't want to hear that," because we were listening to the Drifters and
Oh, okay,
other
yeah,
music like that. Sam Cooke was big in my day, uh, and kids like that. I was somehow attracted to this discordant sound of bebop,
mm,
and I would talk to the old men about this music, and of course they were excited to talk to me because so few young people took an interest.
right,
And I had an aunt in northern Illinois who uh, would she worked in a department store, and I would write her letters and ask her if she could find music by this one and music by that one, and she would go down in the record section of her store and look through, the records, the
mhm,
LPs, with the covers and so forth, and she could not find specific recordings initially, but she had a name, Coltrane, which was
mm,
not familiar to her. And so she saw this record cover, and it had an abstract kind of painting on it. And she saw the name and she took a chance. She bought this album, she sent it to me. And if you remember the album Coltrane Sound
yep,
at Central Park West, Equinox, and so
yeah,
forth, it had a painting of Coltrane, but it was an
that,
impressionistic painting.
yeah,
Yes, abstract. And so I played that record until the needles would not fit in the needle would not fit in the groove. It actually was
wow,
worn out. And
wow,
I would invite my friends over to the house to hear this record that I had, and I would put it on, and dum dum dum
right,
dum,
right,
how
right,
that goes,
right,
or the beautiful melody of Central Park West,
yeah,
da da da,
right,
and they would look at me like, okay, Now, what am I waiting to hear?
Yeah,
They didn't quite get that they were actually in the presence of what
yeah,
I wanted them to
yeah,
experience.
yeah.
So that's sort of a brief explanation, and it continued when I got to Morehouse. Of course, I was in my world because I met many other students, my contemporaries, who had great record collections, and I just dove right in, and we used to. We weren't old enough actually, so we would sneak in the back of a club called La Carousel, which was connected to Pasco's, the famous restaurant,
Sure.
African American restaurant in Atlanta. They had a little jazz club, and everybody played there. Mingus, Monk, Coltrane, and the place would fit about as many people as my living room. It would be jam packed,
Right.
and we would sneak in, and the person in charge knew that we weren't old enough, but they saw how much we liked the music, so they let us. That's how I got
Yeah.
involved.
So interesting. You and I share in common the fact that I was raised by my great aunt and her brother, which actually would have been my great grandfather I never met. He was a professional jazz musician. He died in 1941 at the age of 27 when coming back from a gig one night. He was hit and killed by a car.
Mm.
And actually, I inherited his alto saxophone. But my great aunt, um, who not too long ago passed away at the wonderful ripe age of 102, she was
Mm-hmm.
the church organist for the Mount Pisgah African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Amen. Amen.
And so two things were non-negotiable in that household at 17 South Wandling Avenue in Washington, New Jersey. You had to go to church on Sunday, and you had to learn some kind of musical instrument. Didn't care
Yes.
what it was. You could play the spoons, you could play the Tupperware, but you had to take up some musical instrument. And
Yes.
so she really was the first person to introduce me to jazz, and brought me the Count Basie and Duke Ellington. At the time, this was cassette tapes and eight
Yes.
tapes, and bought me from the Reader's Digest. The Reader's Digest had
Yes.
these extensive collections of big band, and,
Wow.
and he
Wow.
brought me this and said, "I want you to listen to this." And that's really when I fell in love with jazz, and I started taking clarinet lessons at the age I probably was in fourth grade, so that would have been about 9. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to play saxophone, but my fingers weren't big enough, so they gave me a clarinet, which, by the way, um, most musicians that are saxophonists or multi instrumentalists and woodwind players start out on clarinet. Um, that's
Very
not
difficult. If you
it's
play
very
that one, you can
difficult.
play the rest of them,
Yeah,
right?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So I started out on the clarinet and later switched to the saxophone. But we share in common the fact that we had older folk, who helped us fall in love with this thing. And for me, I don't know about you, but there was something that was deeply. I look back at it now and say it. I don't think I realized it then. Something that touched my soul in a way that, um, was beyond words. When I would listen to Duke Ellington or Johnny Hodges play "Come Sunday,"
Oh my. Yes.
or now I'm talking, I was a 12 or 13 years old. So my classmates thought I was corny. They were
Mm-hmm.
listening to,
Yes. Yes.
they were
I know that experience.
you know, they say, "Oh man, I mean, you're a young old man. You're old before your time." But
Yes.
I would listen to Count Basie play "One O'clock Jump," and there was
Mm-hmm.
something that was so deep about the swing of that music that the metronome would make my heart beat a little faster. And I
Yes.
didn't quite get that and I'm not putting down any contemporary, but I didn't get that from Luther. I didn't get
Yeah.
that from Anita
Yeah.
Baker. I
Yeah.
like the music,
All of that is good,
but
but
but it
that's yeah,
didn't
it's a
it
different
didn't
level.
grind against the soul the way
Mm-hmm.
that Ellington did with that big
Yeah.
band, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you and I share that in common, that we had older folks that somehow ignited that love for improvisation music we call jazz.
And look, let me say this. The Coltrane experience was one experience.
Yeah.
Cozy Cold, by the way, I was
Oh, your
introduced
drummer.
to fairly young. But the one that really qualified me for the mental institution was Crazy He Calls Me with Dakota Staten.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I had that album, and again, I had so few records that I would overplay them, and they would get damaged and so on. But I remember my friends not only looking at me, wondering what's the catch. They started looking at each other. You see, and now you know you're in trouble. Like,
Right.
are you feeling the same way I'm feeling? But my on spiritual connection, let me just say, I take the view that God is the author of all of this.
Mm.
And it is human beings who try to bifurcate or separate or segment uh, art of any kind and human experience of any kind.
Mm.
I went, I used to, there was some pretty attractive girls in the Holiness Church in my town. And we would go down after church to the Holiness Church because they would be there forever. And we would actually be going down there trying to catch the eye of this girl or that girl. And when they would get happy, they would start dancing. And I swear, I saw even as a kid some kind of physical connection between that experience and the dancing people did in the clubs.
Right.
And when I went to Africa back in the early 70s and saw traditional dances, I said, wow,
Right.
here was a connection. And of course, in Africa, this notion of the secular versus the spiritual, except that they've been invaded by white missionaries,
Right.
there is no distinction. And
Yeah.
so, in fact, in traditional African languages, there are actually no words for the term religion.
Right.
Because it's all life. And I think that's been an influence to me in terms of jazz. And when I introduced jazz at Bethany in Newark, just as an idea, in the Board of Deacons, one of the deacons said, "Pastor, what on earth does jazz have to do with Jesus?" I said, he's passed away now, but I can still hear his voice when he asked.
Next week on Nuevo Gumbo.
Look, we are very good at declaring on the one hand that God is sovereign, and on the other hand, deciding what God can do.